Thank you all for joining today. Good afternoon, and welcome to this month's gathering of the Northern Virginia Health Policy Forum. My name is Jim Scott, and I'm the president of Applied Policy based in Alexandria, Virginia. Our focus at Applied Policy is to help healthcare providers and industry navigate the world of federal healthcare policy. We're pleased to host these monthly gatherings promoting an exchange of ideas and approaches to the multiple issues that define healthcare today. On the campaign trail, then candidate Biden spoke about setting up an access to fair value of drugs, noting his interest in a German-like approach. So today, I'm joined by a panel of experts to have an informed discussion on the role of the U.S. government in setting drug price policy and how comparative effectiveness research might play a role. So I'm joined today by Gail Wilensky, a former HCFA administrator, which is now the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services under the first President Bush, and then Dr. Stefan Walser, who is a PhD economist and has a market access and a pricing firm in Germany. And so he's going to be our expert to tell us how the German system really works. And Dr. Peter Newman with Tufts University and the Center for Evaluation of Value and Risk in Health. So thank you all for joining today. And then before we get started, my introductions were awfully short, so I'd like to give each of you an opportunity to say a little bit more. And let's start with Gail. You know, we've all heard of Health Affairs, and I've heard of Project Hope, but maybe you could tell us all a little bit more about what you're doing now at Project Hope.
Thank you. Glad to do that. Project Hope has been around for a long time now. Started in the late 1950s. Most of Project Hope focuses on helping people internationally, helping train healthcare workers from laboratorians all the way through providing advanced training for physician specialists. They do that on a mostly volunteer basis by sending people internationally to help and sometimes bringing people back to the U.S. to work with their counterparts in the United States. That portion of Project Hope has been going on much longer. In the early 1980s, Project Hope decided, Dr. Bill Walsh, the cardiologist founder, decided that just as the international portion focused on a very practical way to reach out to people in other places, there should be a journal similarly practically focused and founded Health Affairs as a policy journal. First 25 years, it was led by John Iglehart, who's a well-known writer working with the New England Journal for many years, as well as Health Affairs. Health Affairs continues to be very active, and Project Hope has done more work this year in the U.S. trying to help distribute personal protective equipment here and abroad, and also training health workers how to be effective in combating COVID. For a while, there was a policy center, which I had helped start and direct, and Peter Newman was one of many people who I've had the privilege of working with at Project Hope, and in Peter's case as well when I was running what is now called CMS.
Thanks, Gail. And then let's go to Stefan. Can you tell us a little bit about your background and the work that you do at Mars?
Sure, thank you also for inviting. My name is Stefan Walser. I'm a health economist from background, so studied economics at the University of Tübingen, which was in Germany, did a PhD in Zurich, which was in Switzerland, or is in Switzerland, and have a postgraduate diploma in clinical trials from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Just as a kind of background. I started in the health economic market access reimbursement area now roughly 20 years ago. I think that was as well when I think some of the times were quite easy and pretty probably as well, and especially from an industry perspective. And I think one of the topics today is obviously the German, or let's say the new German way of assessing and negotiating prices. It's already 10 years old, but I think in Germany it's still seen as quite new. I think as kind of, let's say, a bit of the hobby I have as well is obviously as well a bit of teaching. I'm teaching at two different German universities, also in terms of market access and reimbursement. Now since roughly 10 years, I mean, after I have had my experience as well in the industry on different global roles, always in market access and reimbursement, I was basically founding my own consultancy. We're nowadays focusing on the German-speaking markets. So wherever you find the good cheese and the nice mountains, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And I mean, the probably the kind of interesting piece also for today is also, I mean, I have been joining the whole kind of, let's say, also policy discussions already in the early so-called AMNOG days. So when the new German law was basically still in the discussions, that was still when I was in the industry. So we had a lot of tried to as well change the kind of way it was implemented. We have as well then already as well done a lot of scenario analysis. And finally, I mean, I was then quite clearly jumping into that kind of sphere as well with my consultancy. So looking forward, I think I've seen some of the kind of news and the announcements in the US by the Biden administration, different kind of discussions. I mean, looking forward to an interesting kind of round now as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. And then Peter Newman, can you tell us a little bit about your work at the Center for Evaluation of Value and Risk in Health?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks very much for inviting me. So I direct a research center at Tufts Medical Center here in Boston, Center for the Evaluation of Value and Risk in Health. We're an academic research group, about 24 people now. We do a lot of health economics research applied to a wide variety of issues. A lot of it is applied cost effectiveness analysis, again, applied to a wide variety of areas in terms of treatments and also diseases. I'm also on the faculty of the Tufts University School of Medicine, and write about policy issues as well, coverage, pricing, reimbursement, and such. Gail mentioned in the past, I've done a number of things, but I've worked with Gail. She was my boss several times, so I have to be careful about what I say today, perhaps. But I've learned a great deal from Gail, so very nice to join her on this panel. And I look forward to the discussions.
Great. Thank you all very much for joining today. It's really a privilege to have your expertise to share with our audience. To get us started, there are groups in the US like the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, ICER, that does their own value assessments, but that's not a government agency. And so now the talk is moving something like an ICER into a government role. So the German system uses the Institute for Quality and Efficiency in Healthcare, known as IQWiG, and a national drug pricing negotiation to determine drug prices. So this is one of the things that the President Biden has mentioned to negotiate ceiling drug prices applicable to all payers. Tonight, it seems like there would be a little bit of a letdown because a lot of people were hoping that the president was going to say something about drug pricing. But the latest news says that he's going to defer that conversation for later. So in the meantime, today our panelists are going to share some informed views on the German system and what it might look like if something like that were adopted in the US, and what are the pros and cons. So to level set, I'd like to start with Stefan. Stefan, can you please tell us at a high level about how the German healthcare system works, and specifically how it decides which drugs to cover and how to pay for them?
Sure, happy to do so. So I think, first of all, I think it's very important to also differentiate here, let's say generally about the, let's say, value assessments, the benefit assessment, and then finally how the price is really set up. I think you nicely already, let's say, split the kind of question overall already in those two, let's say, important parts. I think that's also how the whole process was set up in Germany. I think, first of all, I think before we start with that kind of different split, I mean, when you, let's say, think about the pricing from the very early days, that means whenever a company is launching a product, so meaning making the price available for the product in an official database, that has the effect that you can basically choose your price as high as you want to have. You have a free pricing for the first 12 months after your launch. Within those 12 months, you have then the whole kind of, let's say, assessment, which is happening with the different institutions. And one of them you have already mentioned with the IQWiG, but it's not the only one. So the first part is basically that the company needs to submit a dossier, which basically includes the different kind of components of, I would say, of any kind of health technology assessment, right? It starts with the description of the disease. It starts with the mode of action of the product. It has then a kind of clear overview of the kind of current, let's say, market situation for the given disease, or including the, let's say, the kind of current therapeutic options, the unmet medical need, and also obviously the impact on the individual patients. What then basically follows is a kind of very brief and very kind of simple, let's say, cost comparison or cost overview, which has the component of the new drug and has as well the kind of component quite clearly, obviously, what is currently being paid for. And that's obviously only for the system where it is being, let's say, as well assessed for, meaning whenever there's an off-label, let's say, therapy, this is not taken into account. So everything is only, let's say, included, whatever is already, let's say, ruled by the GBA. The most important component of the dossier, however, is quite clearly the chapter or the chapters probably on the medical benefit, where you need really to dig into the very much details of the evidence. I think that's also an important component. What, for example, the so-called GBA, the GBA is a joint federal committee, it's the highest decision body in Germany. They're as well always saying they can only judge the evidence. So whatever and is basically submitted, they cannot judge the product itself, right? So that's also something keeping in mind, especially when we're coming to the different kind of, let's say, benefit assessments, which are one of the results of that kind of first components. We're still in the kind of evaluation phase of the benefit assessment. So within that dossier, you need really to go into the details. And I mean, when I mean details, really the details of the clinical study. So the core component when you prepare such kind of document is the clinical study report. So you need to include, for example, the type of randomization, the method of randomization, how the whole kind of study was set up, how the power calculations were done, et cetera, et cetera. So really the kind of details, what needs to be basically included. On top of that, quite clearly, you need as well to have a systematic literature search in the clinical trial databases given by the GBA, and then obviously also in the literature on your product, and in case, obviously also on the comparator therapy. And the comparator therapy is being, I would say, dictated by the GBA as well. It could also be that the comparator therapy, that was one of the changes within the law, and the first, I think, was changed after 4 or 5 years, when the GBA is now giving you a basket of comparators. And within that basket, the company who has submitted can basically choose which of those comparator therapies should be taken as a kind of comparator in the assessment. Beforehand, the GBA directly said, this is your comparator, or maybe they even have given you a basket, but then they have decided which one should be taken into consideration for your assessment. So now you have a basket, the company can choose it, and that is then as well taken into account for the benefit assessment. So important here is also, I think this is a very much administrative process as well, because it's very German-like, right? The kind of different steps are quite clearly defined. So the first part, which is just a 3-month period, is when the institution, so the GBA first of all, or in case it's not an orphan drugs are being assessed by the GBA themselves. Non-orphan drugs are basically being then assessed by the IQWiG. But at the end of the day, it's basically the same kind of work. It has just an impact on the benefit assessment. I'm coming to that in a second. But the benefit assessment is being done within the first 3 months. So within those 3 months, the evaluation body, so either IQWiC or GBA, is taking the dossier and are critically assessing it. So they're going through it, they're checking the systematic research, they're checking if anything is unclear, they're checking your logic, they're checking as well the kind of numbers and data and whatever you have basically presented. A very important point here, I've mentioned beforehand, the comparator therapy, which is one core component, but it's also quite clearly another important component is the endpoints. So the endpoints which are acceptable by the German bodies or by the German body, basically, because the GBA is finally deciding, need to be patient relevant. So any laboratory parameters, for example, like HbA1c in diabetes, or I think other kind of parameters, for example, to measure blood pressure or anything like that, is not acceptable because it's not seen as patient relevant, but only as a kind of surrogate endpoint towards another hard endpoint. So that's also important, and that's also being or needs to be as well assessed. Beforehand, it needs to be explained as well within that process. So after about 3 months, the GBA, independent with the IQWiC, is basically doing the assessment. The GBA is then already putting the preliminary assessment in the public domain. So this is then when it's basically being available on the websites. They're available obviously only in German. And I mean, the benefit assessments are normally, if it's a kind of, let's say, quite clear and small submission, it might be maybe between, let's say, 30 to 40 pages of critiques. If it's a bigger one, I mean, you could even reach easily to between 120 to 150 pages of a critique by the GBA/IQWiC. This part is then basically be the basis where everybody who's affected, patients, patient organizations, industry, physicians, physician organizations, etc., could submit a written statement to the GBA, so their opinion. This is normally within a time window of around 2 weeks after the availability of the preliminary assessment, and which is then basically being followed roughly 4 weeks after that by an oral hearing. The oral hearing is consisting of all of the GBA members. So normally you have, let's say, a room, let's say pre-COVID and probably also post-COVID times, right? Nowadays, everything is well virtually. But I mean, normally you have basically a group of roughly 25 to 30 people of the GBA members. So the different groups, the GBA, Joint Federal Committee, consists of, let's say, two parties. One, the health insurance companies, and the other side is basically then the service providers. So associations from the physicians, from hospitals, etc. So you have those two parts. Basically, they have an equal weight. And then you have as well the independent kind of board members or heads of the GBA, which are also, let's say, the leading drivers of the whole discussions. Within that kind of oral hearing, obviously the kind of critiques which are based on the benefit assessment, first of all, on the preliminary benefit assessment, are being discussed. I mean, interestingly, questions are not being sent beforehand. It's not like in the regulatory process. So the company is basically going in there with a maximum of 4 people sitting there. Whoever has as well submitted a written statement could also attend the oral hearing, and it's then also being heard. And then basically a kind of discussion is starting. Discussion, probably discussion is even the kind of wrong word. I mean, it's really a hearing. So the GBA is asking, the industry needs to answer, or the GBA is asking, and the physicians, for example, could as well come and get into the kind of, that's then probably more kind of discussion. Oral hearing, written statements are then both going to the kind of decision making within the GBA. And after overall 6 months after launch, so 3 months benefit assessment, 3 months kind of decision making, the GBA is then coming up with their final decision on the benefit level. So we have different benefits level. Obviously, the lowest one is lesser benefit. Basically, it's only applied within subgroups. We have 2 cases in the last 10 years with roughly 600 assessments, where even that was given for the product overall in a given indication. I think to me this was just political because the product was available and was just a kind of sign for the price negotiation. And then you have a no added benefit, which has been granted for in roughly, I think, 60% of cases, which basically doesn't mean that a product is excluded. It just means that the price for that product can be as a maximum according to the comparative therapy. So you need to have basically a kind of or let's say the same price as your comparator, or obviously maybe as well lower. Could also well be an interesting case sometimes if the comparative therapy is already quite costly from an industry perspective, to even just go in there with an added benefit, right? And then you have 4 positive added benefits. Starting maybe with the highest, I think this is basically significant or major added benefit, which has just been granted in 5 cases in those 10 years. Then you have a considerable added benefit. This is the second highest benefit. I think the numbers, I need to look it up, but I think it was around 10 or 15%. It's still, let's say, quite rare, but already obviously more given as the highest benefit. And then you have a minor added benefit and the non-quantifiable added benefit. The non-quantifiable added benefit is a very interesting one, because this is the lowest added benefit orphan drugs could currently still get, meaning that orphan drugs are automatically being granted an added benefit, independent which evidence base they have. So the GBA is basically only assessing the level of the benefit. Is it, let's say, a minor added benefit, a considerable, or a major one? Or if the evidence base is just not, let's say, strong enough, they could also grant a non-quantifiable added benefit. Why is that important? Because this is the end of the first part, right? This is the benefit assessment, which is then, let's say, transferred into the negotiation, to the price negotiation afterwards. The price negotiation is happening between the company, so the industry, and the head association of all of our different health insurance companies in the statutory environment. So where basically 80% of our population is being insured. Then we have still about 103 health insurances, but there's one head association, and they're basically on behalf of all of those individual health insurances are negotiating then the prices with the industry. Quite clearly, the higher the added benefit, the more, let's say, the more weight, quite clearly, I think a higher price could be included in a negotiation. What is probably even more important, if you don't have an added benefit, so no added benefit, 60% of cases, you're not allowed to negotiate a higher price in comparison to the comparative therapy. The price negotiation is happening for 6 months. Basically, you have a quite clear kind of timetable. You have 4 different negotiation days, let's say. Each day lasts for 4 hours. Everything very kind of clearly defined, how many people could be in, what could be the kind of, let's say, drivers for the negotiations, etc. Still a lot of rooms really to negotiate. And finally, and after those 12 months, the company and the head association need to come up with an agreement. If that has not happened, both parties could basically call up the arbitration board, which could then as well try to find a solution within another 3 months. Within those 3 months, the free pricing is basically no more really happening, right? It's still running there, but you need to obviously, let's say, put the money back, and you need as well to pay back in case you would come to an agreement, or if basically you would not come to an agreement, then you still need to pay the difference between the suggested price by the arbitration board and the price you have charged in that kind of time frame. So that is basically a bit the kind of differentiation. Benefit assessment, first of all, 6 months. Then you have the price negotiation for another 6 months. You have afterwards potential arbitration board. And just maybe as well, very briefly to mention as well, before the whole process, you have as well the opportunity to consult the GBA in order to get the input for your clinical trials, or also for your submission, in order to maybe as well plan in a more appropriate way. Just in a nutshell, that is the kind of German way how drugs are assessed, and how I think we're coming up with the different prices.
Thank you very much. The 6 months of the benefit assessment, and then the next 6 months of price negotiation, and sort of a process at the end to appeal, where the manufacturer is at risk for paying the difference or whatever, but they keep their free pricing. So I think over here, what I heard a lot of people say is that they love the German system for the first year because it's free pricing. But it seems like there's a lot of work happening in the background over there. So let me ask Gail. You know, you were at HCFA during the first push, before there was even a drug benefit under Medicare, and then so you've been through all of this. How do you see the evolution of the U.S. Reimbursement system for outpatient drugs primarily, and then And is this the right next step for the U.S.?
As you mentioned, was not at CMS when they introduced the drug benefit, but I was at CMS along with Peter when we decided we could do the right price for 10,000 CPT codes, paying physicians under the relative value scale. And that was one messy, painful attempt at relative price setting. I'm not sure the differences would have been that great, although maybe so. I think for the US, there are likely to remain a couple of very significant differences, at least that I hope would be involved in any attempt to think about how either Germany's or other countries' attempts to moderate spending on medical care might be relevant for us. As some of you have heard me say before, I feel very strongly that we should not focus only on prescription drugs. If we're going to make this a serious intervention, it has to be on drugs and medical devices. Too much of the healthcare dollar is not associated with prescription drugs, and too much of the activity goes on with regard to the application of other types of medical interventions, and that it would be a great mistake to only focus on prescription drugs. The second thing is the hard part in terms of understanding what kind of pricing might be justifiable is to do a comparative clinical effectiveness assessment between the new product, and I think there's some wisdom in recognizing that you may need to do that 6 or 12 months or 18 months after it's available, so that there is some learning that goes on, and also potentially some volume of scale that can occur. And then the real question is, how does this new therapeutic prescription drug or technology, broadly defined, compare clinically with regard to the existing technologies and therapeutics? That's really the question. Being able to go within and across prescription drugs and other forms of therapeutic interventions would make this, I think, much more justifiable in the US, and potentially more successful if it included more than just prescription drugs. I don't see us doing a price negotiation that would apply to all payers right now, or that even would be necessarily adopted by non-Medicare payers. But there is some indication that private payers follow Medicare in some of its pricing. Sometimes it'll be a multiple of what the Medicare price is, but on a relative basis, private payers frequently will look to see what Medicare is doing and attempt to follow suit, both because it's politically slightly easier and because some of the work will have been done for them by the government. I don't see that changing anytime soon. For me, the biggest question is, do you include more than prescription drugs? If you don't, I personally would find it extremely disappointing as our next move, and potentially harmful, because it would tend to bias how physicians and other healthcare providers were to choose the interventions that they follow. If we can get people to recognize that this is not just about prescription drugs, that remains the smallest part of our healthcare dollar expenditure as it's been historically. If we're going to take on this kind of controversial activity, let's at least make it count.
Thanks very much for that. And thanks for I really think that's an important point that, considering a prescription drug is just one of the treatment options for any given condition. And so if you're going to compare, you should compare all the treatment options, not just the drugs. I think that makes a lot of sense and would be really exciting to work on. Let me go to Peter. So what do you think are the prospects for a health technology assessment panel in the US? And if there were one, what do you think would be the right way to measure value?
Right. Well, there are many questions here. Gail and I were co-chairs recently of a report put out by USC and the Aspen Institute. Darius Lakdawala was the other co-chair. And we suggest in that report that there should be a new HTA agency in the US, an independent HTA agency. We argue there's a lot of good private health technology assessment that goes on. It should continue. I would include in that the work of ICER, and perhaps we can get back to that. It certainly raises a lot of questions about where this agency would sit and what it would do and how much power it would have. We argue it should be advisory, that information is a public good. This kind of information is useful for the marketplace. Private markets tend to underinvest in healthcare technology assessment. And so there's a need for this kind of work. And that existing agencies, including, by the way, PCORI, AHRQ, and NIH, and others who all do some good work, are really not doing this kind of health technology assessment that could be useful. We point out, and Gail emphasized, it shouldn't just pertain to drugs. There are some differences with drugs and other healthcare services that seem to warrant perhaps more attention, and just because we have intellectual property and we have patents and we have brand name products without competition in many cases. Nonetheless, I mean, she underscores a point that we emphasize and I'd agree with, that it shouldn't just focus on drugs. But the vision really is that this HTA body would be a kind of coordinating center. It would not duplicate what others are doing out there. It would try to fill gaps. It would try to make sense of the evidence base. It would try to collect data or coordinate data collection. And again, it would be advisory. There are different models for groups like this. We mention, and all of them are not perfect, but analogies, but we mention MedPAC, for example, and GAO and organizations like that could be models of sorts. And finally, we argue in this paper that CMS should be required to at least consider this information. Now, that begs a question about what it means, but the idea is that it's not okay for groups like CMS to ignore it. They have to at least take a look at it and perhaps provide some rationale. As far as the value-based price, which you asked about, we would like drug prices to reflect value. That sends the right signals to the innovators to produce what people care about. There are lots of questions about how you measure value. One way is to do it with cost effectiveness analysis, with formal cost per quality analysis, the way ICER does it. And there's some real value there, in my view. Gives you a number, standard. It's a crude, imperfect, but useful way of thinking about value. All the groups, I've been a part of several, emphasize it's a starting point for a really complicated and fraught discussion about value. I think realistically, we're probably not going to get cost per qualities being done in the US by any public agency. I think it's politically just too hard. There are too many groups aligned against it. It raises all kinds of ethical questions and questions about discrimination and so forth. So do other alternatives, by the way. Any methodology will have its own discriminatory consequences and methodological challenges. I think more likely is a group, and we say this in our Aspen USC report, to look at economic and clinical consequences. Do it by looking at disaggregated costs, for example. Put the information out there. Summary measures like cost per qualities can be useful, but you don't have to do that, even as you can inform markets about clinical and economic consequences. And finally, just a word about the German system. I think it has some pros and cons, and it's a thorough process. It's a thorough review of the clinical benefit as far as I can see. They do a serious look at the clinical data. Access in Germany is, from what I understand, pretty good compared to European countries, other European countries. On the downside, the pricing is a bit opaque. There are questions about whether there's consistency in value-based prices across disease areas. And I think, perhaps overall, it's hard to adopt a system into the complicated US system. It works for Germany, given their system. There may be elements we can look at and borrow and learn from, certainly. But I don't see us just adopting it whole hog. I don't see it's possible.
Thanks for that. So I agree, for most of the products that are new, there's going to be a good comparator. But how do you, and I'll ask each of you, how do you assess value for areas where there's not really any good treatments? Like the one that comes to mind now is Alzheimer's, where there's a lot of pipeline products, but not anything really on the market that is truly a treatment of the underlying condition. So when there's not a good comparator, how do you assess value? And let me go back to Gail for that.
That would be a very nice problem to have an effective Alzheimer's drug. I'm all for that. I think what will happen, at least initially, is that if you get something that truly is unique, neither having a drug nor other type of therapeutic equivalent, there will, first of all, it'll be very hard to keep it from being used, especially if it is a serious condition for which there are not good alternatives. And then you would try to look at the kinds of effects we normally look in terms of first, length of life affected, and second, quality of life affected in terms of the population with regard to being able to do daily activities, have interaction with other individuals. There will be an enormous amount of pressure to make something for which there are truly no comparators available quickly. And probably the best hope for the government or for companies or the American public in general is to hope that it spurs competitors in the space, which actually tends to happen relatively quickly, even though the patents will protect the exact formulation. It usually actually produces, if not Me Too similars, kinds of therapies relatively quickly. It doesn't happen, unfortunately, very often. The numbers of truly unique products that we see is pretty limited. But if it does, and if it responds to a real medical and social need, the US will adopt it, period.
Thanks. Stefan, how would Germany assess something like the new Alzheimer's treatment?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically also the kind of discussions we currently already have with a lot of orphan drugs, right? I think, with the new cell therapies, still generally with the ATMPs, right? I think a lot of times, especially for those kind of therapies, you don't have really a comparator, as you said, or maybe very cheap ones, right? I mean, especially where basically no kind of say, development has happened the years before with maybe only generics available. So I think currently, I mean, as said, I think within the benefit assessment, this is obviously not the kind of biggest issue because you can probably and hopefully then also prove that you have an added benefit. Obviously, the kind of core and more kind of discussions you would expect is in the price negotiation. That is what we currently already see. I mean, we had different cases where the insurance side was basically going in with really low prices, exactly what you have just said. I mean, they even tried it for some of the products, even to go to the arbitration board. And interestingly, at least the kind of decisions in the last, let's say, 6 or 7 years were more towards than the industry, where obviously, let's say, kind of more drivers were into the direction either that you have had an analogy to other kind of disease areas with a similar kind of, let's say, direction, similar number of patients, similar situation maybe in the past, etc., and or where you could, for example, as well show the kind of, let's say, comparator more in terms of, for example, costs avoided in the future as well, even though that quite clearly that's maybe and probably the same as you have it within your different, let's say, insurance, streams as well, is that insurance in Germany are normally only looking, let's say, on an annual budget itself, right? Because that's the kind of, let's say, viewpoint they have. So 1 year, that's it. But I think, especially for those situations, we have been quite successful. And that's also, I think, if you look across those different kind of therapies, when you have a special look on the avoided costs or avoided therapy costs, and or let's say, as I said earlier on, if you have a kind of a good story and maybe an analogy to other indications. So ultimately, if you have a look on similar disease areas, as you have just said, we still see, let's say, quite high and attractive prices in Germany, at least for the German context. And also, I think, Peter, you said it beforehand as well, when you compare it to European countries.
Thanks, Stefan. And if the audience wants to start chatting their questions, we'll have a few minutes and I'll try to ask the ones I can. But in the meantime, let me go to Peter. Where there's not a good comparator, like in the Alzheimer's example, what are your thoughts on how value should be measured?
Right. Well, there's always a comparator. I mean, it could be that the comparator is standard of care where there are no good treatments, but that is the comparator, and we can model that based on existing data. Now, there's often disputes about what the comparator should be. The comparator may vary across countries and across regions within a country. That's certainly the case, and that leads to some challenges or difficult discussions about how appropriately to assess a new therapy. The challenge is aggravated because we often lack randomized trials with head-to-head comparisons. So we may need to do indirect treatment comparisons, and there are methods to do that as well, however imperfect. So, I don't see the comparator, the lack of a treatment comparator as being a problem here. And there's always data challenges. And again, it may be that the comparator differs and people may debate what the appropriate comparator should be. Just a word on Alzheimer's. ICER, as many of you know, has been looking at Alzheimer's. I was one of the external reviewers of their report, which I believe is coming out at the end of next week. If it's not, ask ICER. I'm not involved in that decision. And this is a report of aducanumab, the Biogen drug, which will be reviewed by the FDA in early June. I saw an early draft. I'm certainly not going to say anything about the results here, and I don't know what's in the final draft. But the comparator, there's a comparator in the analysis, and the lack of good treatments for Alzheimer's didn't stand in the way of doing an assessment.
Great, thanks for that. And then, so here's a question from our good friend John Wilkerson, and it's to all of you. So we'll go backwards from how I've been going and start with Peter, then go to Stefan, and then end with Gail. So it says, given that Biden seems to be giving up on major drug pricing legislation, what can CMS do administratively? Can government test an ICER like government agency. What are the barriers to pursuing this approach administratively instead of doing so legislatively? And I bet in the back of his mind, he's thinking about the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation and another national innovation project around this.
Right.
So let me get your thoughts, Peter.
Right. Well, Gail's the former head of CMS HCFA, so I'm curious to hear what she says. The Trump administration tried to do things in the executive way, and there were some challenges, certainly, and they withdrew certain things. So to some extent, I think we may not know until we have actual proposals and perhaps challenges how much you can do from the executive branch. Certainly, there are limitations. Everyone is looking at the CMMI as a place to do pilot studies and to try to test new models. And we've seen the models that they've tested in terms of some of the payment models, ACOs and bundled payments and things like that. The last months of the Obama administration had a proposal to do some value-based pricing ideas. It didn't go anywhere and was withdrawn. I would imagine that the new CMMI director and head of CMS will be looking at the Innovation Center as a place to test models. We'll see. I guess, there's some details will matter a lot. Will they do a kind of cost per quality model? Again, I think very hard. There's a lot of interesting innovative contracting that people are looking to, where you pay over time based on data that you collect, a kind of coverage with evidence development approach. I think that will be a place to test some of those models. Again, I'm curious to hear what Gail says.
Stefan, not to put you on the spot, but I was wondering when Germany launched its new system 10 years ago, were there pilots and trials that preceded that it, kind of informed its creation, or did it just materialize?
Yeah, I mean, what they have basically done is also they also took a bit of a tour across different countries. I mean, and then they have basically just implemented it. I think it was probably also, that might be maybe as well an aspect probably in the US, right? And you need as well politically to, let's say, introduce it. I think the longer you wait and the more pilots you probably do, the more you probably, let's say, kill the whole idea, right? So it was basically introduced. I mean, at the very early beginnings, I mean, we had a lot of, let's say, discussion and issues. I think one of the points you just raised beforehand with the example of the Alzheimer's disease was also on orphan drugs. I mean, the very first, well, let's say the first assessments by the IQWiC on orphan drugs were basically, from a policy perspective, not acceptable, because they simply said no added benefit, and hence you cannot, let's say, negotiate a higher price. So the highest price would have been kind of generics available on the market, which was as well at that time back supportive care, right? So that was where also policy has changed. I think the same with the basket of the different comparators. So yes, it was implemented without the pilot, but it's also changed over the last, let's say, 10 years or so. I think at the end of the day, I think, I mean, obviously I cannot really go do the kind of details of the question, but I think let's say a kind of new process will also quite clearly need to fit to the whole kind of, let's say, system. And I think also maybe to take on, I think what Gail and Peter, you have as well said, I think medical devices are also being assessed in Germany with a bit of a different, let's say, process. But interestingly, I mean, as Peter, you said as well at the very end, also including a potential with the coverage while, let's say, developing the evidence as well, which is one of the components which is also possible. The same, obviously, with the whole kind of ATMPs. We have now seen interesting contracts, exactly what you have now just said, where basically the prices are basically being staggered dependent on the kind of outcomes which are given over a course of time. So I think there are probably different components, maybe different buckets in there. I personally don't really see, and I'm not a US expert, but I don't really see the kind of whole German system moving over to the US. Maybe some of the components, but clearly not the overall process, I think, from my perspective.
Gail, as a former administrator, how do you see this?
I think we are very fortunate that the head of CMMI, Liz Fowler, is unusually qualified and experienced to take on this position. She has been at CMS. She worked on the Hill, importantly, during the time that the ACA was adopted. She has worked out in the private sector as well. And I think that is very helpful in terms of coming up with some good ideas. It would be interesting. I don't know that this is something she would be interested in. I would find it important and interesting if CMMI could basically take on the function I wish PCORI had, looking at a major intervention that can either be done with therapeutics by a clinical intervention or with a pharmaceutical intervention involving, say, oncology, where there may well be an option between doing aggressive or non-aggressive surgery and doing biologicals and also doing other types of therapeutics, and attempt at least to show the different ways that a major medical intervention could be approached that may have both different outcomes and different costs associated with them. As a model, if we want to understand the implications of different strategies, that's really so much more important than the added benefit that comes with a particular drug. But once we decide things like that, if that's the direction we want to go, one of the next real questions is, how much of a price do you need to affect in order to change behavior? You mentioned value-based pricing. Most of the value-based pricing experiments that I've been aware of, if they involve government, involves changing 10 or 20% of the update factor, but not much with regard, or anything with regard to the base price. For hospitals, that may be enough. Small amounts of change appear to affect hospital behavior. Just looking at a point or so on an update, changing physician behavior appears to take a lot bigger change, either because they have a lot of payers that they deal with or for other reasons. But I really think if we were serious about this, we need to think about what is it that we would be affecting in terms of trying to change behavior. It would be an interesting use of CMMI. It might be a little politically hazardous for your health if you're Liz Fowler.
Thanks, Gail. Yeah, I had the pleasure of working with Liz back when we wrote the Medicare Modernization Act in 2003, when she was on finance and I was in the Legislative Counsel's office. So she is uniquely qualified and has been through the trenches, and I have every confidence that she'll do smart things there. The other, one of my sort of observations is I'm really surprised that CMS hasn't used the national coverage determination process or its existing coverage with evidence development program that it's used, frequently on devices on physician administered drugs under Medicare Part B, where it seems pretty clear they have the authority to make coverage policy. And from what I'm hearing is that, in all this, before we can get to a pricing negotiation, we have to have an accepted way of defining clinical benefit and value. And that in each of your remarks, you've said you've all put clinical benefit first, pricing second, and that is a necessary prerequisite. So it seems like we're in for a long road ahead that with a lot of devils in the details. But before we sign off, I wanted to offer each of you the opportunity to offer a final thought to make sure that our audience takes away what they need to take away from this. So let's start with you, Peter. A final thought?
Yes, well, thanks for inviting me. Just quickly on the NCD, the National Coverage Decisions and the Coverage with Evidence Development, it's proven, I think, very challenging to actually do coverage with evidence development, to collect data in a non-randomized environment, which is costly, administratively complex. I think it's conceptually appealing, but it's proven difficult to do. I would leave with a couple of quick thoughts. I think there is a legitimate role for the government in health technology assessment that's not being filled, that we could do better. I do think we should try to move to value-based pricing with all of its challenges. And finally, the value-based price might still raise and will still raise all kinds of issues around incentives and affordability. That is, even if we were able to get the value-based price, we still need to change payment systems and do better in other ways. Insurance reforms, getting it out-of-pocket spending, all kinds of things. So I'll stop there, but thanks again.
Thanks, Peter. Stefan, final thought?
Yeah, sure. I mean, at the end of the day, I think there's probably no perfect system, right? I think we have everywhere different kind of discussions. I think, as you said as well, Peter, I think a value-based pricing could be maybe even interpreted, let's say, differently. I think we have had a lot of discussion also in Germany whether, let's say, negotiation-based pricing is also value-based pricing, which is probably as well in a way. However, I think what you also said earlier on, I think that information is or should be a public good. I think that's maybe as well the important component, which is probably also to me the very first part. However, or in which way the kind of clinical benefit would really look like, right? Whether that is basically, let's say, coverage with evidence development, or let's say RCTs, which are basically being assessed, including maybe indirect treatment comparison, etc. I think there are different ways, and that's I think probably the kind of discussion you would probably as well need to have, right, on the methodological kind of basis. But I think given the kind of system, at least as far as I know, I had different global roles, but never really went into the details of the really complex US system. I think, let's say, really offering, let's say, the different kind of, let's say, items also for the various stakeholders within the US system, meaning just putting everything on the table, especially from a clinical perspective. I think that might be probably a kind of good role. And I think there maybe the kind of German way could also potentially help. Also, as I said, also, this system, from my perspective, is not perfect. I think we have as well still a lot of discussion on it, but it might just help with one or the other buckets. Thank you.
Thanks, Stefan. And Gail, you get the final thought.
If we can have two things accomplished, I would be quite satisfied. The first is to have people understand information is a public good. It is a legitimate use of government. Whether you're conservative or liberal, R or D, you ought to understand that. And the second is that if this is going to be of any serious value, we have to look at technology broadly defined and not just focus on prescription drugs. It's simply too big a battle to engage in for too small a gain.
Well said. Well, thank you all for joining us. You can't hear the applause that you would normally hear if we were live, but I'm sure it's happening all around the world from our audience. So thank you all. And Peter, I was gonna, if it's okay with you, I'm gonna follow up and send everybody a copy of the USC Aspen paper so they can read it. And thank you all for joining. We look forward to seeing you next month, so stay tuned for an invitation. And if you're not on our list, let me know and we'll get you added. So thanks again for coming from Germany and Tufts, and I think here, Gail, right?
Right.
So thank you all. This has been a really informative talk. So thanks again.